Consistency in shotcalling is the ability to repeatedly make similar calls between encounter attempts without unnecessary improvisation. This attribute is often taken for granted amongst seasoned shotcallers, and its absence or overabundance will lead to group confusion and frustration. Unlike other shotcalling traits, consistency in calling is optimal in a sweet spot. It does not necessarily improve one's shotcalling abilities to always be in pursuit of more consistency. It may be self-evident to anyone who has progressed through any encounter to know that any form of inconsistency is usually frowned upon. Cooldown usage, positioning, damage, and more all cause group frustration when any one member of the team cannot perform up to an expected standard throughout an encounter in any of these metrics. Callouts are no different. Just like how a healer being inconsistent with their cooldown timings causes uncalled for wipes, a shotcaller making inconsistent callouts causes rippling effects that impact the whole group. Players will often seek patterns throughout an encounter that assist in their latent ability to recall steps to success. No surprise, as the alternative to this would be trying to glean an entire 7 to 20 minute encounter's mechanics in order from raw memory. These patterns come from places like their rotation sequence, boss HP, room effects, third-party tools like boss timers, and yes, the shotcaller themselves. Shotcalling is meant to fill in the gaps that patterns like those previously mentioned may fail to address. A common complaint of otherwise good callers is them sinking into background noise for other teammates as progression goes on. This results from their calls being either redundant, inconsistent, or both. The concept of being consistent with calls ought to be separated from being redundant, and steps to avoid doing so will be discussed. Good consistency is not saying the exact same things for every single mechanic the exact way every single pull. While this is a form of consistency, it is not one that is conducive for the group throughout a whole progression cycle. Good consistency is as much about deciding what to be consistent about as it is about actually following through on being consistent. With that in mind, here are some pointers on how to maintain consistency throughout progression. Be concise with phrases. Decide early on what is actually important to call for any given mechanic that needs calls. Narrow it down to a simple phrase that calls certain people to perform certain actions, like everyone head behind the boss, or DPS bait ads. This will make the calls easier to remember and repeat as attempts go on. Pay attention to when callouts may happen during moments of high personal responsibility on the part of the shotcaller. Combining high APM or high concentration mechanics in an encounter with trying to call often results in forgotten or lackluster calls. If you think you will not be able to reliably call something during these times, it will often be better to skip or delegate the callouts instead of inconsistently calling them some of the time. Bounce ideas off the team regarding what should need callouts and what would be too much. Calling more mechanic components early into an encounter's progression, then toning them back later on as people get more comfortable is the norm for most progression groups. Narrowing calls down to just what is important goes a long way to preventing the background noise dilemma. Be ready for when an attempt does not go according to plan. If the shotcaller gets downed and needs to be revived, they may be thrown off of their tempo, resulting in late or missing callouts. Attempts can usually be salvaged for the sake of extra practice, even if people need to be revived. Be prepared to continue calling what was agreed upon, even if your circumstances unexpectedly change during it. Use tools at your disposal to make the act of calling easier. Add-ons, macros, Notepad open on another monitor. It does not matter as long as it assists you in getting the repetition down for a new responsibility in an encounter, and calls are no exception. If using voice activation instead of push-to-talk, ensure that the first word of a call is not getting cut off. Start calls with a filler word to get the mic activated, otherwise a phrase like, "Don't forget cooldowns" will turn into "forget cooldowns." It would be rather mundane to show examples of consistency being utilized effectively. Good consistency in raid callouts is like good background music, unnoticeable when executed correctly, painfully apparent when not. I will share one recent example of when my own inconsistency resulted in a tangible progression issue, and how digging deeper into the implications of such an event could help reinforce the tips on consistency I shared. We will enter a personal example of how falling short of expected call consistency will result in issues that a shot caller may not expect. To set the scene, we are in the Dragon Song's Reprise Ultimate Encounter in Final Fantasy XIV, a marathon of an encounter, with our eventual clear attempt taking 19 minutes. The second to last phase of the encounter involves two large dragon bosses that mainly sit stationary on opposite ends of the arena. There is a mechanic that happens twice in the phase that requires coordinated party movement to permit both tanks to bait heavy damage on themselves without overlapping with any other players. There are 3 indicators that change how this mechanic may resolve each time. A glowing wing on the white dragon indicates that half of the arena will be denied during the end of the mechanic. The black dragon moves to the outskirts of the arena for a breath attack. This will deny another half of the arena orthogonal to the wing denial, effectively making there a quarter of the arena that will remain safe for everyone to go for this mechanic. And the white dragon either raises or lowers its head, indicating that the 2 large explosions are baited on the 2 farthest or nearest players to that dragon. The players have potentially a lot of ground to cover before the mechanic resolves, given how large the arena and the 2 damage circles are. To better permit the team to focus on their personal movement, I had decided to call where to go when this mechanic occurred. The calls were based off of where to go if one was looking at the white dragon. I quickly decided to not call which half of the room the white dragon's wing was denying, since it seemed like unnecessary clutter. The calls settled into a 3-parter. Towards or away from the dragon, where tanks are going, then where the party is going, such as away, tanks middle, party back wall, or close, tanks on boss, party middle. Ready to move. Towards, tanks on gray, party middle. Looking ready for next mech, ready to move. Away, tanks back wall, party middle. Here's where the importance of consistency comes into play. After over a dozen attempts of me not deviating from this formula, I begin the call, but I start to think that my mic may not have picked up on where I called the tanks to go. So I call tanks on boss, instead of close, tanks on boss, party middle. This causes several people to go stand on the tanks at the boss, causing deaths and an eventual wipe. Why did this happen? The call was not incorrect at all. Nothing wrong was stated. The issue was it went against several players' muscle memory they've developed for that mechanic over the past dozen attempts. They, as non-tanks, are expecting their positions to be called as the ending phrase in the sequence, and my deviation from it without warning caused misplay. There's fault to go around here, and it was briefly discussed before attempting the encounter again. This was a serious wake-up call for me and my calling. The Shotcaller has a surprising amount of power over the group's performance, especially over one that has grown to trust their calls. An over-reliance on calls in this manner may be considered a group deficiency, but it is important to understand that if there has been a precedent set by the Shotcaller to call things in such a manner, then responding to unexpected changes in a way like this should not come as a surprise. Calling mechanics that others can determine for themselves will inevitably mean that they can reasonably not pay attention to them fully. That is the whole point of having someone make the calls in the first place. Mistakes on calls early into progression are likely to happen while everyone is still finding their footing. Be sure to nail down exactly what ought to be said for scenarios of importance quickly, so situations like this one can be minimized. It is difficult to express just how thoroughly one might have to call for their team without going overboard with it. Becoming an encounter timer for your team should be avoided, but moments for adding extra emphasis on mechanics that would assist the team should be spotted by any Shotcaller. Sticking to a rigid system between pulls is an effective way of assisting the team in establishing a muscle memory to mechanics in the encounter. Changes to whatever call system that has been established should be communicated with the group, and calls that become so redundant that they become background noise should be avoided. Consistency in calls is a reflection of the consistency of other aspects of a progression team. How seriously a raid leader decides to go with their calls should reflect the overall goals and expectations of the group at large. I hope you were able to learn something new from this video. Up next, we'll be discussing delegation. Thank you very much for watching.